Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joel Rosenthal, and I serve as president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And I'd like to begin by thanking all of those who are joining us, both in person and online. And a special thanks to our Carnegie Council trustee who is with us in person this morning, Kristen Kaufman. Kristen, thank you. And also thanks to our friends at the British Consulate, led by Hannah Young, the Consul General here in New York. Thank you, Hannah. For over 100 years, leaders from around the world have visited this council to engage in civil dialogue and to reflect on the most pressing moral questions in global affairs. And it is within this tradition that I'm honored to welcome James Cleverly, Home Secretary for the United Kingdom, to the Carnegie Council. Since his election to Parliament in 2015, Secretary Cleverly has held multiple distinguished government positions across international relations and national security landscapes, having most recently served as UK Foreign Secretary. Today, we'll hear from the Secretary about the opportunities and challenges faced by countries as a consequence of migration, and the need for enhanced multilateral cooperation, a critical issue that Carnegie Council is also working to address through our Model International Mobility Convention. I'm now pleased to invite Secretary Cleverly to the podium. Thank
you. We need to talk about immigration. Now, even saying those words is enough to send some eyebrows soaring and some voices muttering, which is crazy. Because the conversation around this subject has become highly polarized and highly toxic, and that is really bad news. Because if we can't do balanced and thoughtful conversation, we can't do balanced and thoughtful policy making. And today, I want to set out why it is so important that we do balanced and thoughtful policy making. Let me first say a word about this wonderful city, the wonderful city of New York. I think it is a fitting venue for this speech, and it's been a major hub for inbound immigration to the United States for centuries. And the Carnegie Council are the perfect hosts, with a proud history of setting the global agenda and a mission of using the power of ethics to build a better world. Let me talk about my country. British society has been molded, developed, and enhanced by centuries of immigration. And without it, the UK would not be the place that it is today. I am a descendant of immigrants on both sides of my family. My mum came to the UK to work in our National Health Service from Sierra Leone around 1966. And my father's family came to the UK from Normandy in 1066. British historians give a little chuckle, everyone else a bit lost on that. Look, my country might be a physically small, wet, windy island, but we are internationalist at heart. We're a multiracial country. We have a history of being welcoming and generous. And our global heritage and connections can be seen in our language, our food, our culture, the representatives in our sporting teams, and indeed the representatives in our politics, in our government. Ethnic diversity that we display as a country is so long-standing and so commonplace that it is largely now unremarked upon, barely merits a mention. And the UK's post-Brexit legal immigration system is designed to allow us to control immigration and to welcome people from every corner of the earth that have the right skills and the right talents to support our public services and boost our economy. And of course, well-managed immigration should also ensure that the people who we accept into our country also share our values and our standards. I'm very proud of the fact that the UK has, for a very long time, played its part helping those fleeing conflict. In recent times, we have offered safe and legal routes to over 500,000 people seeking refuge for themselves and their families since 2015. And they include, but not limited to, people from Ukraine, people from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and Syria. And we support community sponsorship for refugees and have initiatives to support displaced people in accessing our labour markets. The UK also invests heavily in international development and aid because it's an investment in security, in building future trading opportunities, and in supporting future global stability. And, of course, because it is the morally right thing to do. Having explained some of the benefits of immigration, it is important that we also recognise, we cannot hide from the fact that immigration can also cause tensions, challenges, and sometimes problems. Talking about myself again for a moment, one of my favourite subjects. When I was first elected to politics, it was on the London Assembly, the basic London city government, and that was in 2008. My first 4 years in elected politics, I sat next to someone who had also been elected by the population of one of the most ethnically diverse and internationalist cities even in the world. Even though that individual was a representative of what was basically a neo-fascist political party. And he was elected in large part because immigration, in East London in particular, had been badly mishandled, and mainstream politicians had largely ducked the issues about the community tension that immigration has caused. That's what happens. That's the potential risk if we get this issue wrong. Now, we need to look at a range of things. We need to look at the impact on GDP, on culture, but also on the pressures of cohesion, housing, and public services. We can't just talk about the amazing positive impact on the NHS that people like my mother and other immigrants to the UK contribute, but then not discuss the sometimes unpredictable and increased pressures on public services that unplanned immigration brings. And we must recognise that whilst the benefits of immigration to a society can typically be widespread and dispersed, the downsides, the pressures, the challenges can often be felt very locally and can create real hotspots. And we've seen this throughout history, from the time of the Huguenots coming to East London through to, sadly, the Notting Hill riots that we saw in West London in 1958. And New York, our hosts today, a world-famous, diverse metropolis, hugely enhanced by its cosmopolitan nature and the mix of the people that live here. But it has too faced real tensions because of unplanned immigration, and politicians cannot, must not, ignore that. Now, whilst I've talked about the localised impacts of immigration, we've got to recognise that immigration is international by nature and by definition. People move in the modern era for the same reasons that they have always moved: for their physical safety, and for economic opportunity. There is nothing new about going where they believe the streets are paved with gold. But this phenomenon is amplified and accelerated by modern technology and modern transport means. Journeys that used to be difficult to arrange and potentially take years to accomplish can now be done very quickly and can be arranged on a mobile phone. And if it is an illegal journey, it can be facilitated by a people smuggler who is neither in the country of origin or the country of destination. Likewise, the fact that people send so much money back home, both formally and informally, means that a whole family can harness the benefit of one person's risk-taking. Global remittance flows exceed $840 billion last year. Now, altogether, there is an estimated 281 million migrants on the move, accounting for about 3.6% of the global population. And of that number, well over 100 million are forcibly displaced people. And the momentum is very much in the direction of even greater travel flows, whether for economic reasons, or because of conflict, or because of climate change, or natural disaster, or hunger, or other factors. And counterintuitively, an initial increase in a poor person's wealth can actually make it more likely that they move because they have acquired the financial means to do so. And so we must all expect, unless we do something about it, larger and larger numbers of new arrivals, whether they are in transit to another country or whether they are seeking a permanent home. And of course, economic migrants often spread their wings and travel to places far from their original homes. And whilst well-intentioned, blithely insisting that wealthier countries can simply take higher and higher numbers of migrants is, I'm afraid, deluded. It is neither economically nor socially sustainable. And we often pay too little attention to the impact of migration on the countries that people are leaving, often in very large numbers. A talent drain can be devastating on a country, causing not just human flight, but capital flight, gaps in the workforce, and indeed security issues in those countries. It can be extremely expensive for those countries to train professionals, only to see those professionals take their skills elsewhere for what they perceive to be a more lucrative lifestyle. And also in the receiving countries, citizens will suffer if those countries fail to invest in the skills and training that they then plug, the gaps that they then plug with immigration. And I also feel that there is something rather distasteful, perhaps grubby even, about a country concluding that there are certain jobs that are beneath its own citizens and should be left exclusively to be done by immigrants. But as I said, in a very polarized debate, it is important that we leave space for a degree of nuance. Because, of course, some countries urgently need an injection of labor and skills. Countries with aging populations may need immigrants to support their economic needs. And some are already adjusting their immigration policies accordingly. But even in those circumstances, migration needs to be legal, predictable, and well managed. Now, whilst many immigrants move to a new country full of excitement and hope, seeking a new and more prosperous life. Sadly, others move with a heavy heart because the circumstances in their home country have forced that move upon them. Now, I am very keen to see the vast majority of the Ukrainians who have taken refuge in the UK return home. Emphatically not because they are not welcome, because they very much are, but because I know that that is what those Ukrainians want. I hope that they will look back on their time in the UK with immense fondness and affection. But I also want to make sure that Putin fails and that the Ukrainians that we host are once again able to go back to their own country, a country which is safe and free from occupation. Now, not only does conflict and corruption create refugees, but we've also seen a new phenomenon where hostile states deliberately create refugee flows as a way of destabilizing other countries. Belarus is an ignoble example of this phenomenon, sending thousands of desperate migrants to its border with Poland in an effort to antagonize the European Union following the imposition of sanctions for their culpability in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Other people, of course, are fleeing famine. Others will have faced natural disasters. And this is one of the reasons why the world must come together in its fight against climate change. Now, migration is an inevitable, and as I say, in many instances, a welcome part of the human story. But in many cases, what people yearn for is a safe and happy home in the country of their birth. And countries are entitled to ask, it's quite right to ask, what is the virtue and purpose of someone coming to live in our country? And in this instance, once again, we need to employ thoughtfulness and precision of the language that we use. Because people have very different reasons for moving, and those reasons should not be conflated, confused, and they are not interchangeable. If someone is an economic migrant, they should not be treated like a refugee. Refugees should typically seek sanctuary in the first safe country they reach, and country shopping is a very different matter entirely. For example, no one has to cross the Channel to the UK because France is an unsafe country. Being trafficked to a country against your will is not the same thing as choosing to pay a people smuggler to get you there. If you come to our country or a country as a student, you should not automatically expect to stay there for a job. Not all invitations are permanent. Leaving home because you have to is not the same as leaving home because you choose to. Now, wealthy countries do have a moral duty to help the poor and dispossessed, but doing the right thing by those people does not necessarily mean relocating them to our country. And central to solving the international migration challenge is doing more collectively to help people stay at home and thrive in their countries. Because the international community must never start from the premise that some countries are beyond hope and will always be moribund economically or riven by conflict or presided over by dictators. That fatalism serves nobody. Improving safe and legal routes for refugees is, of course, important, but it cannot be the summit of our ambition. We need to take on the conditions, the circumstances that create refugees and drive large-scale migration in the first place. And the UK does this, both by being one of the largest investors in overseas development assistance and also through our policy of increasing our trade volumes with the developing world. Because if we are to address the scale of movement, we have to address the reason why people move. And given the choice, poor people move to where they think more wealth can be sought. So supporting the poorest countries through international development can play a role in lifting the most vulnerable out of poverty. And the UK is proud to be one of the largest spenders, both in quantum and in proportion in the world. But, as I say, we cannot do aid alone. International trade is the only sustainable way that we can make the poor people of the world less poor. And allied to that, the moral case against illegal migration is unanswerable. Of course, people should not come to a country illegally. Of course, it is not fair on the host population. Of course, it will undermine popular support for legal migration. And of course, it weakens our collective ability to help those genuinely in need. But of course, that's not the whole story. Illegal migration is lethally dangerous. It is facilitated by criminal gangs who care not one jot about those whom they treat simply as human cargo, and who use to profit their foul trade and finance other criminal action. In recent years, tens of thousands of people have died attempting irregular migration, and the world cannot stand idly by and let this carry on. And so we need to work together to break the business model of these criminal gangs responsible for driving up illegal migration numbers. And international cooperation in all these areas is essential. Just as the world has come together to address climate change and to seek to end and prevent conflict, so it needs to do the same to combat this new great challenge of illegally facilitated, unsustainable migration. And we're being innovative in the UK. Our migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda is an innovative way of dealing with illegal migration. It is designed to act as a deterrent by making it clear that people who come to the UK illegally cannot expect to stay. But it will also provide illegal migrants to the UK with an alternative home in a country which is genuinely welcoming and thoughtful to refugees. And it's called a migration and economic partnership for good reasons, because we are making an investment in Rwanda, a country which seeks to export solutions from a continent which sadly has been synonymous with exporting problems. And we're also working closely with our nearer neighbours, with France, to stop illegal channel crossings to good effect. And I've just signed a deal with Frontex, the European Borders and Coast Guard Agency, to exchange more information and intelligence and take on the people smuggling gangs together with our near neighbours. As Commissioner Johansson, the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, said in our recent meeting, in order to fight a network, you have to build a network. And that's what the UK is doing. And we've also secured close cooperation on migration with a range of other countries, including India, Vietnam, and Albania. And more recently, we have seen other countries consider the need to do more, including exploring safe third country models for dealing with illegal migration. And indeed, Italy has developed with Albania its own model for processing asylum claims overseas. And the thing that strikes me is that the governments of the countries that I have mentioned are led by a variety of political hues. Because this is far from just a function of political philosophy. It's about hard reality. Illegal migration affects them all. And dealing with this challenge also means considering together whether the multilateral institutions designed and created decades ago, in some instances half a century ago, need updating to meet the challenges of today, and indeed whether we need new frameworks to do so. Those who cherish our multilateral institutions I want to make it very clear, the UK and I do. We recognise they are mighty accomplishments and they should be preserved. We should be the most passionate advocates for adapting them to the profoundly changed circumstances that we see around the world. Because some institutions that we value aren't working as effectively as we would wish and as they need to. And we must reform them or watch them atrophy. People sometimes think all these institutions have been preserved in aspic since they were created. And that's simply not true. For example, the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees was revised through a new protocol in 1967, expanding the protections beyond Europe to all people fleeing conflict and persecution. And we need to make sure that the treaties, the conventions, the international agreements and structures that govern immigration policy are up to date, are relevant, and are not anachronistic. That they continue to support those who need support, but they are strong enough to resist abuse. And there are several recent precedents for increased global cooperation on these issues. In 2018, the UN General Assembly adopted the Global Compact on Refugees. It provides a framework for long-term support and more sustainable responses to refugee crises, with a focus on supporting refugees and host communities in developing countries closer to the point of origin of the refugees themselves. And the UK is a champion for longer-term approaches to protracted displacement, and we want to help to ensure that refugee children, especially the most marginalised girls, are safe and getting an education. The Compact, in turn, establishes the Global Refugee Forum, a ministerial meeting every 4 years. And at the GRF last December, the UK government committed to a quota for the UNHCR-referred refugees, with an overall cap on safe and legal routes. And we ardently encourage other countries to follow suit. The United States of America and Canada are world leaders in this area, and we, of course, will learn from their experiences. Delivering a more effective global approach through the implementation of a global compact for migration, which is central to our international development work. And my former department, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, is doing a great deal of regional work to improve livelihood and to support the countries that absorb migrants, in some instances in far greater numbers than we are. Because reducing the vulnerabilities faced by migrants is both an urgent moral mission, and there is, of course, a degree of informed self-interest for developed nations such as ours. The UK will significantly increase in the UN, in the G7, international financial institutions and other global fora to rally greater support for a multilateral approach to these issues. For example, in October, the Commonwealth heads of government are meeting in Samoa. This year, Italy, a country that's been at the receiving end of very significantly increased numbers of illegal migration, holds the presidency of the G7. G20 meetings being held in Brazil. And of course, South America is a continent which has long dealt with the difficulties caused by mass migration. And the UK will host a meeting of the European political community, a group perfectly suited for discussing illegal migration and the management of that within the European continent. These and other major international summits this year will be moments to mobilise action. And today, I'm calling for a big, open, global conversation about what more we need to do together to deal with these changing circumstances. And the UK will show the same sort of leadership on this as we have done on climate change and conflict prevention and the good management of artificial intelligence. Success depends on a holistic, whole-of-route approach. Whilst remaining welcoming and generous, we must urgently consider this level of migration and the impact that it has, not just on those countries where migrants seek to settle, but also those through which they transit, but also the countries they leave behind, and of course on the migrants themselves. We need to do more together to smash the people smuggling gangs, to address all the drivers of forced displacement, to help people thrive in their own countries, to encourage developed countries to invest greater sums in international development, to support countries that wish to settle more refugees, to tackle irregular migration further upstream, to consider how we need to update international architectures around these issues, to increase international trade so that we can find together the right balance of economic and cultural growth and, of course, control. Now, much of this work is already happening, but I'm here to tell you that we must inject greater urgency. So later today, I will meet with representatives from a host of different countries, from our European neighbours who face similar pressures to those faced in the UK, to countries who face the opposite challenge with large swathes of their population emigrating to foreign lands. I'll be inviting countries from across the globe, as well as institutions like the United Nations, the International Office for Migration, the UNHCR, to discuss these issues. Because the size of the challenge must be met with equal ambition. Any approach to global migration that is not rooted in international cooperation is doomed to fail. And yet, the solution to even the hardest problems lies within our reach, and we must have the ambition, we must have the courage to grasp it together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. We're going to take a seat and we'll have some conversation. Thank you. Well, thank you, sir, for your leadership, for coming to New York to make this statement, and for coming to Carnegie Council in particular. You're in the right place. In our title, Ethics in International Affairs, you've made the moral case in addition to the practical case, which is what we're all about. Just before we have conversation, I did want to alert you to the Model International Mobility Convention, which is on the seats for those of you who are here. For those of you online, you can access it online, but it speaks to many of the issues that you raised about facilitating international cooperation as the key to solving our problems with global scale migration, which we're all feeling acutely at a local level. So please take a look at that, and I can thank Professor Michael Doyle, who is the senior fellow in charge of that project. So I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions.
Sure.
Thank you for your willingness to field some questions and conversation in addition to your speech. So please, in the audience, if you have questions in a minute, I'll ask a couple and then I'm going to open it up, and then we'll also have online as well if people want to submit questions. So international cooperation, global governance is a challenge across many issues. I'm curious how you're thinking about the issue just of burden sharing, right? So you talked about the different destination countries who are facing very similar challenges, but in order to have some cooperative venture, there'll have to be some kind of framework to share the burdens. Have you given some thought to just kind of a framework for burden sharing in terms of receiving migrants?
Yeah, I think ultimately what we should seek to achieve. So let's recognise that migrants fall into a number of different groups. As I said in the speech, we, I think, have slipped into the habit of talking about all migration as basically the same thing. And we have a wide range of different types of migration. As I say, broadly falling into two camps: those seeking economic betterment, long-standing and perfectly reasonable, noble aspiration, and certainly as certain parts of the world see declining birth rates, potentially aging and declining populations, it may be there's a degree of self-interest to have an inflow of working age people that are going to make their permanent home in a country. That needs to be managed well, needs to be planned, it needs to be, as I say, well managed. In terms of burden sharing, I think implicit in the question is a focus more on forced migration, whether people are moving through conflict, typically conflict being, and has often been a big driver. And I've been to refugee camps. I've been to refugee camps in Jordan, been to refugee camps in Lebanon, and in other parts of the world where you have displaced people. And the thing that comes across over and over and over again is a mix. A very clear desire to go back home, to restart their lives, to see that conflict conclude. A number of them, of course, say, actually, you know what, my country's broken permanently, and I want to go somewhere else. And say, we've hosted refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, and other places in significant numbers. But ultimately, the maths dictates that the solution to very large-scale displacements of people through conflict, the maths dictates that cannot possibly be resolved by just saying, okay, your country is broken, come and live in my country, particularly if that movement isn't structured and managed. The maths just means that is impossible. So if that answer is not possible, then the answer which is left is that we work really, really in close cooperation with our partners to try and resolve those conflicts, to try and ensure the people who do typically want to go home, whether it's people from Ukraine, people from Syria or elsewhere, are able to do so. So some of the burden sharing is about hosting, get that, but some of the burden sharing is also about working really, really hard, whether it's through conflict resolution, overseas development assistance, diplomacy on the international stage just up the road in the UN and other fora, for example, to try and resolve those conflicts quickly and effectively, because it's in our interest and the interest of the displaced people to do so.
Right. You talked a little bit about what's driving the sort of different types of migration, right? Everything from economics to conflict to climate. So can you tell us just a little bit more about how you're thinking about sort of addressing the problem at its root or at its origin? Again, there's a spectrum of different challenges there. Can they all be dealt with in a similar way, or do they have to be disaggregated and treated differently, especially like with the climate issue, right? So this is going to drive even more and more forced migrants, I think.
Yeah, look, it might do.
Yeah.
It might do. It has already.
Yeah.
I was very proud when I was Foreign Secretary at the COP27 at Sharm el Sheikh. Is that 27? I lose track of which numbers it was. The COP meeting at Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. I was very pleased to announce the UK's contribution to the to an adaptation fund, an African agricultural adaptation fund.
Yeah.
The population of the African continent is huge. It is growing. And again, it's one of these things whereby if we just write off that continent, if we basically just say, look, Africa is a broken continent, it's never going to be able to feed itself, and therefore it's inevitable that there is going to be a whole-scale movement of African people out of the continent of Africa, typically into, but not exclusively into, Europe and other places. That's just not going to work. It is not going to work. Africa could and should not only be able to feed itself comfortably, but be a significant net exporter of food. And there's a whole load of reasons why that doesn't happen. Agricultural efficiency, underperforming government, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we can do one of two things. We can say, oh, Africa's broken. This is why I say we must avoid fatalism. Because if we just say, look, Africa's broken, and at some point, the hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people that live in Africa are going to come to typically Europe, right. Then all bets are off. I just cannot see how that could possibly work. What could work is through investment in technology, the application of money, the application of support to good governance, right. Making sure that African governments receive the tax revenues that they deserve, to make sure that extractive industries are not exploiting the continent and stripping their natural resource and seeing the profit accrue elsewhere. Those things can be addressed.
Right.
If we address those things, Africa becomes an economic powerhouse, and the problem of mass export of African people diminishes, perhaps even to zero. And that would be, it would be good for European stability, it would be good for African stability, reduce the chances of war, et cetera, et cetera. That is a solvable problem. Not easy, but a solvable problem. A couple of 100 million people moving to Europe is not there is no solution to that. That would just break the system.
Right.
So we must avoid that, and the answer for me is quite clear.
Great. I'm gonna open up questions right here. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for being here very much. I really.
Yeah, please wait for the microphones.
Yeah,
Thank you. We're online,
sorry.
so thank you. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Louis. I'm from the Colin Powell School at CCNY, the City College of New York.
Yeah.
And first, I would like to thank you for being here. And when we see the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, it is not just tied by our past history or language. It is also because of the values and beliefs in human rights, freedom, and democracy. However, those values sometimes are being questioned when it comes to global politics. Recent investigations have shown that Rwanda is actually behind M23, killing people in the east region of the Congo, which having taken place for the past 25 years. We are counting more than 12 millions of people killed. The United States, on 17 February, issued a statement condemning Rwanda. So my question is the following. What Congolese people have to do for them to win the empathy of the UK on naming one of his allies, the Rwanda government, to stop the mass killing on the east region of the Republic Democratic of Congo? Thank you.
Thank you. And I've met with, when I was Foreign Secretary, not in this current role, but when I was Foreign Secretary, I've had the opportunity to meet with the political leadership of DRC and the political leadership of Rwanda. I've spoken about the conflict on the border between DRC and Rwanda and M23. We've spoken with the Rwandan government about this and the efforts that we expect of them to try and reduce conflict, to reduce violence in that border region. I've also had conversations with the leadership of the DRC about this, and we are looking internationally with our friends and partners in Africa to try and resolve that. Now, ultimately, the relationship that we have with Rwanda for migration management is separate to the conversations that we have about conflict resolution in eastern DRC, the western part of Rwanda. We are working with Rwanda to make sure their institutions are robust, to make sure they act in accordance with international law, to make sure that any people that come to Rwanda from the UK through this partnership are safe, secure, that there is no risk that they are deported back to their country of risk. So we're making sure that there is the appropriate safety framework for the individuals. And we do that work in parallel with the work that we do on conflict resolution and peace in the continent of Africa. They're not mutually exclusive, and there are many parts of the world where we seek to manage migrants. And the other point I would make, of course, is that the UNHCR works with Rwanda on refugee management. It's not the same as the arrangement we have, but the UNHCR clearly sees Rwanda as an important partner in the management of immigration, and we, at least in part, take a lead from that relationship. Thank you.
Kristen.
Hi, thank you, Secretary, for being here today and launching your new multilateral framework. As you start building out this framework on including more multilateral measures to address the migration crisis, how do you envision including cities? Because cities, whether it's London or New York or Manchester, deal with the brunt of this issue, but we oftentimes don't have a seat at the table, even though we are tasked with providing the services for this population.
Yeah, this is a very, very, very good question. It's a very, very good question. I made the point, actually, in the speech that that you often find that the challenges, because everything has, everything in life, everything in the world has entries on both sides of the ledger. And this is not unique to immigration. I wouldn't want to imply that it is. But often the benefits of immigration, as I said in the speech, the kind of the GDP bonus, et cetera, is widespread. It's displaced both in time and sometimes in displaced in geography and in time. But the pressures can be quite acutely felt. Cities have typically been places that have a large gravitational pull for migrants. I was born and brought up in southeast London, in Lewisham. Lewisham is, I would say, probably at the moment a majority non-white London borough. The figures might be slightly out, but if it's not a majority non-white, it's a very significant minority. As I say, in East London, we've had waves of migrant for centuries. French Huguenots, Jews from Eastern Europe, Muslims from Bangladesh and other parts of the world, and that has been part of the story of London. There are huge benefits that are derived from that, but there are also challenges. I think the relationship between cities and their national governments has got to be a highly effective relationship, because ultimately it's the nation-state representatives that sit around the UN, sit at the G7, G20 and others. So the conversation internally within countries between cities and national leadership is important. I also think cities could do more working with each other. Often there is a bit of a kind of ad hoc relationship, and sometimes you see the mayor of New York visiting the mayor of London, mayor of Birmingham talking to the mayor of Chicago. We have twinning relationships. It's not as well structured as it might need to be. I don't think it should be for national politicians to dictate those relationships, but I do think there's something about, the idea that in some instances, Paris and London and New York have more in common with each other than they do with the rural communities, for example, in their own countries. And so getting that coordination at city to city level, I think is a really, really good idea, because many of the challenges are shared internationally. I don't want to dictate it, I'm just dropping in a helpful suggestion.
Back here.
Hi, thank you for being here, Home Secretary. I was just wondering, are there any policies in the UK that you've seen be successful that you feel the US could maybe replicate? And vice versa, is there any kind of US policies that you would take on board for the UK?
I mean, the US and the UK have got many, many similarities, but our scale, our geography, our histories mean that I'm always cautious about taking kind of half-cooked, half-baked lessons from each other, because we are very different. We are very, very different countries. There are certain things that in the UK that I'm very proud of. I mean, traditionally, we've been very, very, very good at integrating migrant communities. And I think that the fact we have a Prime Minister of Indian heritage, I'm of African heritage, my Trade Secretary is African heritage, former Home Secretaries of Pakistani heritage, the Mayor of London Pakistani heritage. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So I think we have been a world leader at demonstrating the diversity of Britishness in our government. I mean, we joke about our sports. I joked about our sports teams and various other bits and bobs, and the fact that many of the most iconically British things are not terribly British at all. Fish and chips, Jewish Portuguese, and a root vegetable from North America, royal families from Germany, etc., etc. So I think the integration piece, we've been very, very good. Look, that's under pressure at the moment. That's under real pressure at the moment. And we hope to resolve that. I am willing to learn lessons from anyone that's getting the integration piece right. We've been really, really good at it. I still think we're one of the best in the world at it. But it's proving harder than it has been in the past. So if we can find the kind of the magic recipe for re-establishing ourselves as gold place on the podium of integration of migrant communities, I'm happy to export that to anyone that cares to listen. And again, if anyone's got better ideas than us on that, I'm absolutely willing to listen to that as well. But ultimately, as I say, I think one of the big lessons that we need to learn, and there's nothing particularly new about this, is that we either deal with this together or we won't be able to deal with it at all.
More questions?
Right, Steve? Seriously?
I have one more,
Cool.
this is sort of a leadership question. You're coming to New York. You made a passionate case for sort of reinvigorating the multilateral system. But I want to push you a little bit more about where you see leadership within that system coming from. Maybe there's a political question. We're in election cycles here. I know in the UK as well. So there's the US, UK, but also sort of the conventional analysis now is that the global South, right, the BRICS countries are becoming more and more important in the sort of multilateral system. So have you given some thought to kind of how you see this playing out sort of in a geopolitical sense about getting buy-in from not just the US, UK, but other countries and other regions of the world to make it a genuinely global multilateral effort?
Yeah, look, when I was Foreign Secretary, I made a series of speeches and interventions basically saying the global power balance is shifting, and that is inevitable. It's not a negative. It's just, I think, a statement of the bleeding obvious. And wealth and power is moving eastwards. It's moving southwards, gently, but pretty consistently. As I say, actually, one of the things underpinning the point in the speech is when it comes to the management, potentially of very, very large-scale movements of people, there might initially be pressures as people who are previously too poor to consider relocation become wealthy enough for that to be a credible option, but whose countries are not yet wealthy enough to discourage them from moving to countries that have a higher GDP per capita. So there is a challenge that we need to navigate through. So I think as Africa as a continent becomes wealthier, India, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, as these parts of the world become wealthier, there may be an initial but potentially temporary pressure for large-scale human movement to the high GDP per capita countries. But if I was, and I've not had this conversation, but if I was having a conversation with one of these countries that's on a pretty aggressive growth curve, and I said, what would you want to do? Would you want to see your brightest and your best, your most talented, the future leaders, economic, political, etc., of your country, en masse leave your country? I am pretty sure that they would pretty consistently say no, they don't, for two reasons. One, as I say, you've got the talent drain, the very people that are driving that economic growth, the future economic, political, social leaders. You don't want them all leaving the country, your country. And also the signal that it sends. If you're a country with a great aspiration for your future, but what you're synonymous for is just people hemorrhaging from your country, that contradicts your message. Are you a great country to live and work in, or you're a country where everyone's trying to flee? Because you can't be both. And so I do think that there is a relationship that we could and should have with the countries of the developing world, the global South, to basically say, look, we have a shared interest in this. And we want your country to be safe and prosperous. You want your country to be safe and prosperous. Let's work together to make that a reality. As I said in the speech, support through ODA and aid is part of that, but that can only ever be temporary. The real sustainable way of making those countries no longer large-scale net exporters of human capital is by making sure that those talented people want to stay in those countries. And that's about trade. Yeah, it's all diplomacy for political stability, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the real history tells us the real driver of wealth and stability is international trade. That's how my country became wealthy. That's how this country became wealthy, and that is I think that is the greatest gift to the world, to make sure on good, sensible, balanced, sustainable terms we trade with the world trades with us, and then that way they get wealthier, we get wealthier, and we stem the flow of what could potentially be a hugely destabilizing phenomenon of that mass unplanned movement of humans.
That's great. I want to conclude with an issue that you raised in your speech, but maybe you could amplify a little bit more, and it goes to the values question. We've been talking a lot about the global governance and big systems like diplomacy and trade and governance and so on. But you spoke a little bit about what we owe the migrants themselves as individual human beings. And especially when you were talking about the sort of the moral case against illegal immigration, right? I mean, these are real individual people with lives and so on. And so I was hoping maybe you could conclude with just sort of an affirmation of what we, let's just say the United Kingdom, the United States, and our national communities, what you feel we owe people who are moving across the world. That might be a good place for us to.
Yeah, and the point I wanted to get across in the speech is that it is natural, it's normal, it's understandable when you see people who are suffering to just say, well, my country should be a place of refuge. Right. We've got the Statue of Liberty in the harbour here. It was an implicit promise to the poor and dispossessed of the world, and as I say, when in the times when people coming to the US, for example, would come one steamboat at a time, that was manageable. The kind of scales that we're seeing at the moment, I don't think we can make the same kind of offer. Now, the moral obligation that underpinned that Statue of Liberty promise is still there. But I think rather than just shrugging our shoulders and saying, yeah, your country's broke, your country's is destitute, your country is a hopeless case, so come live in my country. As I say, I think that's fatalistic. I think that's wrong. I think it's unsustainable socially, economically, for all the reasons I said out in the speech. But also, it's just such a sad message if we just point around the map and say, that country's broken, that country's broken, that country's broken, that country's broken, and I'm going to do nothing about it. I'm really deeply uncomfortable with that. And so I think the modern evolution of our generous, humane offer to poor people in the world is to help their countries be more stable and less poor. There will still, of course, be a need and a desire to welcome people into our homes, metaphorically, and actually in the UK's sense, literally. And when those numbers are relatively modest, there is really good public buy-in. But get it wrong, you lose that goodwill. You can burn through that goodwill. Mm-hmm. We all have it, but it is not a bottomless font, and we need to be realistic about that. So we want to ensure that we have and we maintain that font of generosity. It's the right thing to do, both pragmatically and morally. We must always recognise that we're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about individuals. Mm-hmm. This is why it's so heartbreaking when I see stories of people who are dying in the Mediterranean, dying in the Channel, because they put their lives in the hands of some of the most evil people, these people smugglers, who steal, they abuse, they rape, they murder the people who have turned to them to try and help get a better life. We have to undermine their business model. And my final point on an issue I feel very, very strongly about is we can't inadvertently support the business model of these evil people smugglers because we feel that it is the morally right thing to do to give our hospitality first and foremost to the people who are able to get here. Because often the people most in need are the people least able to either fund or endure a criminally facilitated journey of thousands of miles. And we shouldn't necessarily reward the wrong people through a sometimes slightly misplaced sense of moral duty. We do have a duty to the poor. We do have a moral obligation to the poor. Absolutely clear about that. But it's not best discharged by automatically rewarding often economic migrants who are using criminal gangs to jump ahead of people who are in much, much greater need.
Right. Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming here. Thank you for your leadership. And I hope some of the people in this room and some of the people online will rally to it. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
All the best. Cheers,
Yeah.
love.